So fantasy functions are a system I use to quickly build a world each week from random details like draw out of my bucket. I invented the term for this, but fantasy world builders have been doing this process for like forever. Tolkien and Jemison both point out that we use the real world to judge the veracity of our secondary worlds that we create. And I bring this up mainly because Tolkien was like the first one to look at world building as a concept, and Jemison is teaching a master class on world building, and has won all those Hugos and Nebulas and such, based a lot on her world building, and obviously the prose and all that as well. These are like the first and most recent famous world builders, so I think we should probably listen to what they have to say. This fantasy world building is different than sci-fi world building, which usually stands in the present and looks to the future using the speculative fiction ideas. Fantasy, on the other hand, stands in the present and looks to the past. That's why our fantasy functions have two real parts. The first is the fantasy conceit, which I have a video about and is hopefully linked below if you want to check it out. This is how you've changed the world itself. This is the speculative fiction, which is what fantasy and science fiction and horror and a lot of others fall under. And in that, you're sitting there and thinking, what if? What if I made a major change to the world itself? Be that, the addition of dragons and magic, or taking away sunlight and water, or that kind of thing. You're standing here wondering, what if I'd made this major change, and what are the ramifications to the world because of those changes? Fantasy conceits usually fall under 8 categories: geography, biology, physics and magic, metaphysics, technology, and then culture. And they go down this pyramid that's hopefully showing up on the screen right now, where the changes made higher up in the pyramid, like geography or biology, have larger effects on the world itself. Mind you, a lot of the things that show up in the stories itself, or in the world, are details that are further down the list in technology and culture. So these 8 sections are where most of your fantasy functions happen, your fantasy conceits happen to make your fantasy functions. And they kind of form an equation, which is probably scary if you hated math, but it's like a simple substitution equation, kind of. Let's say like A equals 1, B equals 2, C equals 3, etc., etc. You're trying to find an equation to change that just a little bit and feed a secret code to someone, so you add 3 to it. So A, instead of being 1, is now 4, B is 5, C is 6. You see like the simple thing that comes with it. And so your fantasy conceits are taking all those weird variables and making a kind of equation out of it, of how you're going to change the world. Sitting down and thinking about, if I have dragons and magic but no water, this is what the world is going to be like. And that's your new equation. So let's say it's 2x plus 1. Now, the important thing about this is that, and the reason we call it an equation, is because it's consistent, which is one of the 4 C's of world building, which is another video that's probably worth looking up. You want that to be consistent every time, because that is one of the major things audiences look for in a world to be successful. So that's why it's an equation, because the equation spits out the same process each time you put new things into it. And there's a lot more that goes into fantasy conceits, like the antecedents, extrapolations, prime movers, that kind of thing that's covered in the other video. But once you have your fantasy conceits and you have your equation, it's time to start plugging some things into it. So we do this with analog cultures, which are the culture and the time period that we're drawing from inspirations in the real world. We used to use a lot of toehold details, which are covered in the video about this before, so worth checking out as well. Toehold details are details from that culture to signify to the audience that this is the culture we're taking from. So if you have a knight in full plate armor charging with his lance down, you're going to go, oh, this is a medieval Europe analog. And if you have your samurai sword and bow and talking about Bushido or an equivalent thereof, then you're going to know it's a Japanese analog, classical Japanese analog we're taking from. We take these toehold details, and pretty much any detail we want, but specifically the toehold details, and push them through that fantasy conceit equation that we made just a while ago. And the new details we get that come out are what we use to populate our world. Remember though that anything not covered under a fantasy conceit is not changed because of fantasy conceit needs to abide by the rules and understanding of the real world itself. So unless you have a fantasy conceit that water is flowing up a stream because of a magical effect, water needs to flow downstream, gravity is in effect, that kind of thing. But if it falls under the fantasy conceit, then you feel free to plug anything, any detail from the real world into it, and using your speculative fiction, wondering what if, figure out what would be the outcome from that. So last week I had a fantasy conceit that involved a randomized one that involved invoking spirits to use magical effects. And my analog culture was the samurai. So I took the idea of the daimos and the samurai sword and used the spirits, their ancestor spirits that they worship, are the ones giving them power because they inhabit the swords. So I was taking the sword, which was the analog, the whole detail from the analog culture, and adding the fantasy conceit to it to get a new detail to populate my world. In the building up phase, which I always use, which is the first part of my world building process, is putting the fantasy conceits together, is building that equation. And once you know what your equation is in the building up phase, then you can build out, and that's by running the details from the analog cultures and the Toho details, etc., to get the new output details to populate your world itself. And it's just a quick and easy way to build new worlds, and it's just by recognizing what fantasy authors are doing all the time. I just try to do it really quick once a week. There you go, that's fantasy functions, which you can post to fantasy conceits and analog cultures. I hope that you can use them to build some better worlds.